So I'm going to be telling a strange story today about petroleum heritage. As Lena said, I work for Historic Environment Scotland, so I'm a heritage professional, a mutant geographer, in fact, originally. And so I'm interested in the physical remains of industry, and from a Historic Scotland perspective, we are obviously interested in Scotland's industrial heritage, which is of global significance, but I have overflowed into the international scene, and so I have a wider remit, and you're going to get a taste of some of that today. So what I'm going to do is just very quickly say a bit in general about industrial heritage, because I see my role as polluting heritage with industry. I see that as being important because Scotland's biggest contribution in terms of influence in the world is industrial and technological. And then I'm going to move on to petroleum heritage, which is obviously the focus of today, and talk a bit about a thematic study we did, trying to find examples of real heritage relating to historic petroleum. And then leading on to a workshop that we had in Ontario, and the implications for petroleum heritage that come from that, and then this strange collaboration between Ontario and Galicia. And if you're like me, you don't know where Galicia is, do you? I'm sure you don't. Well, you'll find out. In fact, the truth is there's more than one Galicia, so that's a giveaway. And then just a final postscript really about petroleum heritage and where it's going in a quite surprising way. So a quick introduction to industrial heritage, and I think it's important to say that in most of the well-known industries there is a sort of recognisable physical presence. So if you take the iron and steel industry, you tend to get blast furnaces, and most people who know anything about industry can recognise a blast furnace. And this is Volkungen Ironworks, in fact, in Saarland in Germany. This is a World Heritage Site since 1994. So very much an iconic thing. And if you take a spiritual view of the world, then most of you probably know what whisky distilleries look like in Scotland. Some people refer to them as the pagodas of Scotland. I'm sure many of you have been to them. There aren't so many around here. There's a big grey distillery at Leven or Camelbridge, but further north you'll find these beautiful parts of the Scottish landscape. And this is an industrial thing. But perhaps in my field, and in the field of energy, which is what we're talking about today, coal mining has perhaps the most evocative physical image, recognisable signature, if you like, of what a surface arrangement of the coal mine looks like with its head here. These are examples in Asturias, which isn't far from Galicia, but that's a different Galicia, in northern Spain, near a place called Gijón, or Gijón if you're English. And so these are recognised, these are conserved in fact. And closer to home, this used to exist just down the road in Glenrothes. This was the Rothes Colliery, opened in 1958, a fantastic piece of modernist architecture by the Austrian architect Egon Riss when he worked for the National Coal Board. And when these were demolished in the 1980s, 90s, we lost the single most valuable navigational aid for being able to drive through Glenrothes without getting lost. So, but other energy also has its iconic components and recognisable components. These are perhaps very unusual, but these are the amazing 4 brick-built gas holders in Vienna, which have been repurposed in a really fine adaptive reuse scheme. So gasworks are very much part of the urban landscape. This is a more conventional gasworks. This is in Rome, and these two have been repurposed. But when you see something like this, you know it's very much a symbol of the town gas industry, that is gas derived from baking coal. Back in Scotland, of course, we have a very, very interesting heritage of renewable energy. So these hydropower installations and dams across Scotland, we've listed quite a few of them in our Power to the People programme. So again, you recognise hydropower as being physically, and quite a lot of it has been conserved, so much so that this year's Hydropower and Dams International Congress is going to be in Edinburgh, and they're actually promoting it by talking about the heritage of hydropower, which is amazing. So we look forward to be able to work with them in the future. And even nuclear power has very fine, recognisable architectural attributes. On the top left, you can see the Dounreay sphere, the fast breeder reactor, and on the top right, Hunterston A nuclear power station, which I believe should have been protected because it's a marvellous piece of design. If we move away from energy, just briefly, if you take textiles, for example, when you talk about textiles, you think about the North of England, you think about Dundee, its incredible jute mills. This is actually Łódź in Poland, and most incredible, the Manchester of Poland, we felt the most incredible place where a lot of the mills have been adapted and reused, and I'm hoping to go there later this year. So textiles are great, and the reason I mentioned textiles is because it was our most recent thematic study. Now, my organisation, International Committee on Industrial Heritage, advises the International Council on Monuments and Sites, who are in turn the advisors of UNESCO. So we do thematic studies to try to work out across the world which are the most important sites, heritage sites relating to specific industries. So we completed the textile industry, but we also thought we'd better do something about petroleum. And that's really what this talk is going to focus on. So reflections on the petroleum industry. Most of you, have any of you flown out of Edinburgh Airport? Have you noticed these big, enormous pink things on the right? You see in the picture here. These big mountains of spoil. These are spoil heaps from the world's first modern integrated petrochemical industry based on shale oil. So that happened in the 1850s in Scotland, and it was extremely important. Now, the problem with this is there's almost nothing of it surviving, because what do you do with an oil refinery? Yet, there is a small museum, the Alban Valley Museum, most of which is promoted, is an animal farm with cuddly animals. But they do have this little bit on the oil industry of Scotland, the first oil industry, and it's really good. And you can see there was Scotch petrol. Young's paraffin revolutionised oil lighting and saved a lot of whales from being killed. So this is really all there is of what was an enormous industry up until its death in the 1960s. And BP, one of the roots of British Petroleum, is Young's Paraffin Oil Company. So this came from Scotland, and yet very, very few people know about it. And if we look back at historic petroleum, Elena will smile because she knows this is Baku in Azerbaijan, and this was a place where an astonishing explosion of petroleum exploitation took place in the second half of the 19th century. Two people that were responsible for this were the Nobel brothers, and this is the Nobel House in Baku, in the centre there, within which there are these extraordinary photographs of the development of the oil fields in Baku. And they're still going, they're still very, very active on the shores of the Caspian Sea. And it's just a wee sort of reflection that while the Nobel brothers were doing this in Azerbaijan, Alfred Nobel, of the Nobel Prize, was doing this in Scotland. So another form of energy, we call it dangerous energy. He had harnessed nitroglycerin and built the world's biggest high explosives factory in Irvine, to the southwest of Glasgow in Ayrshire. So Alfred Nobel lived in Scotland for quite a while. Actually lived near Falkirk, and so there's this wonderful Nobel connection. And this is where our imperial chemical industries came from, which no longer exists. So if you go back to Baku, one of the problems with this sort of industry is its physical heritage was built not with longevity in mind, just to make money. And these things fell apart through use. They also evolved as industries do. So you can't sort of take any moment and fossilize it and say this completely represents the industry. But there is nothing these are all facsimiles, these are all fakes, if you like. Very good ones, and they're very good interpretation, museum-wise, but they're not the real thing. So our petroleum study had to spread more widely to try to find examples of where real petroleum heritage had survived. This is what Baku looks like now. And it's extraordinary. If you like James Bond films, the Pierce Brosnan film with Sophie Marceau in it, one of the better James Bond films, which features the oil fields here. Incredible scenes, quite smelly as well. So in Scotland, when we think about the oil and gas industry, we think about offshore oil and gas. This is an iconic photograph of Princess Diana visiting the Forties field, the BP Forties field, in the 80s. And the problem is, all the really iconic stuff is offshore and isn't really conservable either, unless you're Norwegian, but that's what we'll come back to that. The onshore manifestations tend to be portal frame steel buildings full of stores and stuff. So there really isn't much in the way of physical heritage with which we can commemorate this. On the right here, this is the Forties field. Now, it's worth just stressing the importance of offshore oil and gas to British history particularly, and depending on your political persuasion, there are lots of discussions to be had about what happens to the oil well. But this is the Forties field, and if you look at oil markets, Forties crude is one of the benchmarks of the price of oil, and this is one of Shell's most important fields, and it's almost completely decommissioned now. Brent Charlie, the Brent Sea in the distance, we'll come back to that. So, like the textiles industry, we have done a study of the heritage of the oil industry across the world, and it's been an extraordinarily difficult thing to pin down. There are incredibly important centres of oil, the oil industry out there. On the right here, you can see a bit of the tap line, the Trans-Arabian pipeline, which was one of the most important factors in the evolution of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia as we know it now. And in the centre is Oil Springs in Ontario, which we're going to come back to. So we published this report in the hope that we knew it was a first shot at something, in the hope that it would elicit some responses and we'd get people, well, complaining about it, saying, no, we've got something that's real, we've got something that's much more important. And so here is Ontario, and this is Oil Springs, and I couldn't resist it. In the Oil Springs website, they have this wonderful Scottish person. So it just goes to show wherever you go in the world, there are Scots everywhere. And needless to say, across Canada. I mean, there was go for a bit of a giveaway, but there were Scots involved hugely. So where we are is we're almost in the United States. And this is the oldest operating oil field in the world. So we're close to a place called Sarnia, and if you pop across the bridge, you're practically in Detroit. So, but we're in Ontario, and we're talking about the 1850s, and particularly 1858, when the first drilled well yielded oil. And the really interesting thing about it is it's still going. And so this is the scene. It's actually more messy than the Baku pictures, which were almost cataclysmic. But this is the scene as the Ontario oil field was being developed. So we thought we need to go. This was the one that was a candidate that was going to be likely to be the oldest. So we thought we'll have our workshop launching the thematic study in Canada. It just happened we were having our Congress, and I was explaining to colleagues earlier, this is our first post-COVID Congress. We had to delay it by a year. So we had a Congress in Montreal, and we preceded it by going to Ontario. I don't know about you, but when we first started meeting, I would stand up in front of the audience and say, I hope you don't mind, I've got to take a picture of this. So I got into the habit of taking pictures of audiences, which is I'm aware of. So this was the Petroleum Heritage Workshop in Sarnia, in Ontario, and we attracted 30 or 40 people from all over the world to discuss in more detail what was the most important oil heritage out there in the world that we could say was authentic and genuine. And the first thing to say is, amongst them was representation from Drake's Well. Many of you will know about Drake's Well in Pennsylvania, and it cites itself as the birthplace of America's oil industry. Well, unfortunately, first off, it's got a fantastic museum, but it's all reconstructed. And secondly, it's a year later than the Canadians in Ontario. So really, the Canadians probably can claim to be the birthplace of North America's oil industry. So this is where Oil Springs is. As I mentioned, we're right on the exact United States. It's in the middle here. And they have a donkey. Now, you understand the significance of this. Those of you saw the pictures in Baku of these pumps doing this. These are known as nodding donkeys. So, yes men, if you're Dutch, Dutch call them yes men for some reason. But here, there were 200 of them, 200 nodding donkeys, but a real donkey, very vociferous donkey in the middle of it all, which has added to the weirdness of this extraordinary place. So if ever you go to Ontario, you need to go here. And this is the scene. It's almost idyllic. These fields with these nodding donkeys go, all operated essentially by lines of line shafts from central, a half dozen electric motors in engine houses through what they call jerker lines. And this has been producing since the 1850s. And it still is. And that's Pat Fairbank, and that's on the left is Charlie Fairbank, and they, with a small workforce, maintain this oil field. And it's the most extraordinary thing. There isn't much of a smell, but there's a slight smell, especially near the actual wells. And it is quite remarkable. I've never seen anything like it. That's in the red hat. It's James Dewey, the author of the thematic study, talking to Charlie. Now, what this raises is an issue, I think, of a really interesting issue relating to industrial heritage, which is this relationship between tangible heritage, which we have in Oil Springs, and the intangible. Because Charlie's getting on. And this is the Petroleum Museum, which has a lot of expertise and knowledge built into it. But Charlie makes a lot of his own parts for these wells, and he relies upon this guy, Baines, Mr. Baines, in his repair works and manufacturing in nearby petroleum. And he's, I think, in his 80s, and his son refuses to take on the business. And so we have all this expertise that's about to die, unless there are ways of managing succession and bringing it on. So this is another example of how, if you have authentic heritage, it's really difficult to maintain it in working order without some form of intervention on the skills front. So we had a really interesting workshop. But in the middle, we knew they were coming because they told us they were coming, but we didn't know exactly why they were coming. But there was this delegation from Poland, and what they proposed was very interesting because the Fairbank oil site had put itself up to be included in Canada's tentative list for World Heritage nominations and had been knocked back by the National Park Service of Canada. And so they were very upset about that, and they felt that they were immensely significant on the global stage, which I agree with. So they were in a bit of stasis, and then our Polish friends turned up. And what they suggested was that the two sites, their site in Poland, which we'll come to in a moment, and the Canadian site, step forward and do a joint or serial nomination. And they felt that might be a way of reinvigorating the Canadian site's nomination and producing something much stronger, much more international. So this is the place. They have a museum at Bobruka. Does anybody speak Polish? Yes. So I wanted to apologise because Being a British person, I have trouble even with English. So languages are not a strong point. So this is what we've got. It's a hugely important working oil field from the 1850s on in Poland. And so this is the moment when we consider the collaboration in more seriously. So those of you who thought Galicia is in northern Spain are correct, but there is another Galicia in the south of Poland. It was pretty much all in Poland until the mid-1940s, when once again Poland's boundaries changed, and now half of it's in Ukraine. And it looks remarkably similar to the scenes in Baku, really, if you look at the historic photographs. And so they have an amazing history, including they claim to be, don't doubt them, to be the home of the kerosene lamp, which revolutionized lighting in the 19th century. So these are the people that turned up from Bobrka and from Icomos, Poland, to put a formal proposition that a joint combination is put forward. And I think it was viewed with great enthusiasm. Now, one of the reasons this is really interesting and exciting, and I think extra valid, is that the people who developed oil well drilling technologies came from Lambton County, Oil Springs area of Ontario, and it was them that went to this part of Poland to develop the oil industry. So there's this fantastic, absolutely practical connection between the two places, unlikely though it seems. And in fact, McGarvey's inventions made a massive difference across the world, particularly in the United States as well. So the revolutionary drilling technologies from Ontario are linked irrevocably to the oil industry of Galicia. So really nice thing. So lots to work on there. So I wanted to finish off by paying a wider tribute to our friends in Norway, who I think have taken oil heritage further than anybody else. And we look to them for inspiration because for many people, petroleum is a really difficult subject, not only because of climate change and what it's perceived to have done to the planet, but so it's politically awkward, quite difficult. You have to really have a good, strong argument prepared to promote petroleum heritage. Personally, I think we can't look at the world with any degree of seriousness without actually understanding how we got here. And we're going to have to live with petroleum for a while yet, as we decarbon ourselves. But we need to understand how we got here. And the history of petroleum is extraordinary. Like all branches of heritage, energy heritage, it is heroic in its nature. And it's come at a great cost, both to the environment and to people. But nevertheless, it is an extraordinary story. And if we're to move forward, we need to understand how we got here. And so I really applaud the Norwegians for taking us forward with confidence about petroleum heritage. And they have, has anybody been to Stavanger? Stavanger, the oil museum is extraordinary in Stavanger. It's just an amazing piece of history of science and technology. It's a fantastic teaching aid for science, technology, engineering and math subjects and so on. But it's just awesome, just amazing to think what they've done. They had this bridge which linked Scotland with Norway in the North Sea, which allowed people to escape the dreadful canteens in the British side, serving artery-blocking breakfasts, and go over and eat healthily in the Norwegian side. So this was the bridge, and this was been brought ashore and been cut up with the decommissioning of the Fred gas field with an installed backpipe, just for good measure. So I wanted to mention this because has anybody watched State of Happiness on BBC4? Yes, there again. So State of Happiness. I'm sure some of you have seen The Rig. Yes, with Martin Compston on TV here. Anyway, inferior compared to state of happiness, but is the story of how oil arrived in Norway, in Stavanger, in a sardine tank. The second series has got a bit more technical, but it relies heavily upon what's in the museum and what's been recorded as part of the petroleum heritage that has been recorded and captured by the museum. If you haven't seen it, it's on BBC4. It is the most amazing TV and an incredibly important story. And just to continue the story, the people in the museum include Bjorn Lindberg. Bjorn is a big fan of these incredible structures. So these are what they refer to as condeeps. You see the blue squares at the top there. You can see the Eiffel Tower, the Empire State Building. These things are bigger than that, but they float, and they were built in fjords. And then, in the case of the Scottish fjords, this is Brent Charlie being towed around from a fjord in the west of Scotland, in Argyll, all the way around to the Brent field that we saw earlier. I haven't seen any structure like that. And to me, when I talk about petroleum being heroic, at all scales, from drilling a small well to this in the North Sea, it's extraordinary. To think that this was done before big computers, this was done with slide rules, with proper manual drawing boards, no computer graphics, and CAD and all the rest. So I think these are incredible things, and Bjorn is suggesting that one of these could be given World Heritage status as well. So, and the Norwegians understand, and they've got all this hydro, they're self-sufficient in hydropower, but they understand the importance of offshore oil and gas, so the evolution of Norway. And they even made sure that a lot of the wealth was captured in a sovereign wealth fund, which we didn't do in the UK. So I really admire their attitude to what is a difficult subject for petroleum heritage, and they wish to commemorate it and recognise the contribution it's made to the evolution of modern Norway. And if they manage to do that by saving and then getting Condeep designated onto the World Heritage List, that would be fabulous. And it would sit very nicely alongside the 200 nodding donkeys and the real donkey in Ontario on the edge of the United States. Well, that's me. It's a very strange voyage I've taken you through, but I hope it was of some interest. Thank you.